Welcome to the church basement. I'm Andy, and I'm a recovering addict. Now, maybe you've heard people use that term before, recovering addict, or that they're in recovery for addiction or alcoholism. But what does that mean exactly, recovery? Before talking about recovery, it'd be good to understand addiction, which has its own video, which is linked in the description. So go check that out. And just like I did in the addiction video, quick disclaimer. I'm not an expert, a counselor, a mental health professional, or a 12-step guru. Yes, they exist. I'm just a guy who found recovery and the things I've learned in recovery to be extremely helpful, and I'm here today in part because of recovery. I speak from my own experiences, and what I share is not the final authority. It's not exhaustive or inclusive of all the ways that people experience recovery and treatment for addiction. Also, this is going to be somewhat general since many of my videos will probably focus on recovery topics or ideas in some way. This is really just a quick overview of what recovery is. This is not a guide to being in recovery or a substitute for anything. This is just educational, I hope. So what's recovery? Recovery is a process that helps people deal with and heal from addiction. Now, a lot of people think getting sober is how you deal with addiction. Getting sober is important, but it's different than recovery. When people talk about sobriety or getting sober, they're talking about not using addictive substances or behaviors that they're addicted to. Recovery goes beyond sobriety. It's about healing from addiction. It's a process rather than a goal or an outcome. Trying to get and stay sober is typically part of that process, but they are different. Sobriety is a focus on abstaining from the addictive substance or behavior or even certain activities related to the addiction. Recovery typically includes a focus on sobriety, but there's also a larger emphasis on working through the thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and actions that enable and lead to addiction. Sobriety is important and honestly might be enough for some people, but my perspective is that people who are truly addicted will be better off if they focus on recovery, not just getting sober. Why? Because sobriety is about stopping. And don't get me wrong, you need to stop if you're addicted and it's ruining your life. But you can't just stop at stopping. You also need to start. And recovery is about starting. Starting to make good, wise, healthy decisions so we don't resort to our substance or our behavior going forward, and we learn new ways to deal with life. Sobriety is about stopping. Recovery is about starting. As I said, recovery is a process, which is why people say they're a recovering addict or in recovery. I've never met a single person who said they were a recovered addict. That's not really the idea. Recovery isn't a destination or a goal that we arrive at or we graduate from. It's a process we enter into and we stay in to continually heal, mature, and grow. So what are we healing from? I define addiction as the use of something, a substance, or a behavior to cope with life in a compulsive, obsessive, dysfunctional, and harmful way. And that thing or behavior takes on this key role in our life. We need it, we depend on it in order to manage and deal with whatever we're going through. The downside is there are consequences to dealing with life this way, and addiction affects all areas of our lives, physically, emotionally, mentally, relationally, and spiritually. We become unhealthy people, so you can think of recovery as treatment that allows us to heal each area of our lives that has been affected by addiction. Depending on the addiction, there are many ways that addiction affects us physically. The common denominator for all addictions is within the brain. The brain gets hooked on dopamine and other chemicals which are released in higher and higher quantities through using addictive substances and behaviors. Getting sober allows the brain to reset back to normal levels. This is a rough process, but it is essential to recovery. A big part of recovery is dealing with all the emotions that were stuffed away and numbed for so long. We learn with the help of others what we're feeling and how to talk about it. Shame is the primary thing addicts feel. So when we bring the shame out into the open by naming it and sharing it, it loses power and influence over us. Recovery is where I and many people were able to bring our shame and everything else we feel and experience into the light and deal with it appropriately. In recovery, we like to say our own best thinking got us here. The stuff that goes on in our mind led us to this place of desperation. It's not going to get us out of our problems and our consequences. In recovery, we work on what we call stinkin' thinking, which we discover when we work through the steps. Our attitudes, our thoughts, our reactions all get brought to the surface to deal with and get help with changing. In recovery, for the first time in many of our lives, we are known. Who we are, what we've done and what we're going through is shared with others, we are heard, and we're fully known. For many of us, this is the first time we've experienced true intimacy. We develop supportive and intimate relationships. We learn how to relate to others, and it ripples out from there, affecting all of our relationships that have been damaged by addiction. In recovery, many people for the first time in their lives learned what true trust and dependence on God meant and how to do it. In addiction, there is a dependence on something or someone or some experience to make life okay. This is a type of idolatry. We depend on something to make us feel alive. In recovery, there's a focus on surrendering our will and turning to God to make us feel whole and fill that void that our addiction used to fill but was never enough. So that's primarily how recovery heals and helps people. But what actually happens? Like, what is involved with being in recovery? What do you do? The specifics vary for everyone, but from my own experiences, from knowing what other people are doing in recovery and having read a lot of the recovery and 12-step group books that are out there, basically, recovery involves this: taking steps towards healing and growing, relying on support, and what is commonly referred to as a spiritual awakening. Now, that might sound a little new agey, but I think it's actually a good phrase that describes an important moment or realization that most addicts experience when they get into recovery. I would say these three things make up the foundation for recovery from addiction. So let's break it down. Steps. Recovery has a big emphasis on action. In order to stop one thing, we need to start doing something else. We focus on quitting our drug of choice by starting a new way of life, by starting to process the causes of our addiction, by starting to take concrete steps of dependency on God, by starting to work and resolve the pain, the chaos, and the consequences of our addiction. Typically, if someone realizes they need help or they want to get sober, they are probably going to find themselves in a 12-step group or recovery group. The original 12-step group is AA, or Alcoholics Anonymous. The foundation of these groups is the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, which are typically modified for each addiction, but are basically the same in terms of meaning and purpose. I'm not going to go through all the steps in this video, but in general, the steps help addicts in recovery take healthy steps towards accepting their reality, trusting God, understanding their addiction, healing from the fallout of their addiction, righting their wrongs, and then helping others. This looks super different for everyone, but in general, people tend to work through the steps formally and informally. Working the 12 steps formally with a sponsor is usually an intentional, thorough process that can take a while. The process takes whatever it needs to take. It's not rushed, and it goes in order. Then there's informal, which is more of an adoption of the meaning and the purpose of the steps in your day-to-day life. Maybe one day you're focused on steps 1, 2, and 3, and another day on step 10. By working the steps formally or thoroughly, you sort of pick up new tools that you can use day to day. What's interesting about the 12 steps is that none of them lay out a specific action about not using. There's not a specific step that even references getting sober. That's because the steps are more about dealing with everything that is enabling the addiction. In addition to the steps, a lot of the skills, tools, and actions that people rely on to stay sober and recover are typically learned within the community, in meetings, from your sponsor, and from other people that you connect with. An area that addicts typically need to focus on is developing new coping skills and adopting different ways of coping with life. As I mentioned at the end of the addiction video, if someone gets sober, they're going to be left with a big void. Their main coping mechanism is gone, which is great because it was ruining their life. But the problem is life is still going to be a challenge, and especially if they're dealing with the consequences of addiction. So part of recovery is learning to fill that void with new behaviors, actions, beliefs, and thoughts so that you don't default to the addictive substance or behavior to cope. Learning these new skills and thoughts and working through the steps and developing these new actions, really navigating recovery, is all done with the help of others, which leads us to support. Recovery is not a solo journey. You do it with others and you need help from others. Recovery can involve all sorts of support levels that help a person deal with their addiction, and no one person is the same in what they need. Some people need inpatient type care, rehabilitation or rehab, where someone stays at a facility to deal with the initial stages of withdrawal, shame, maybe grief and pain. Some people use outpatient care, and many use counseling and therapy, but really the foundation of recovery are the 12-step groups. Clearly, it depends on what someone is struggling with that determines what they need. But in general, being in recovery means you're actively receiving support from someone, whether it's a professional or a peer, and eventually the hope is that you provide that same support to others. I talk a little bit about my first 12-step group experience in the Church Basement introduction video, and I'll share more as time goes on. But what makes the basement such a special place to me is the people who gather there. For me, my support network, this community of people I am able to rely on, is such an important role in my recovery. Meetings, phone calls, going through the steps with a sponsor is where most of the actions I mentioned, they get put into practice and they develop. The steps and the actions we take, they take work and it takes support. It's not an easy path, and others make it much more manageable for us. Also, my experience has shown me how being part of a community where you're fully known and accepted allows for shame to be processed and wounds to heal. There's accountability, there's wisdom, no condemnation, lots of grace, lots of understanding and empathy, and there's no BS. It's real, honest, and safe. Some of the safest people I have ever met have been in recovery. Johann Hari, in his TED Talk on addiction, says the opposite of addiction is connection. From my experience, there is no recovery without support and connection to others. And that leaves us with the spiritual awakening. What is that all about? Well, there's a section in the AA Big Book that captures what I'm talking about. It says this: if a mere code of morals or a better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome alcoholism or any addiction, many would have recovered long ago. But we found that such codes and philosophies did not save us, no matter how much we tried. Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly. We had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves. The spiritual awakening that seems to be part of so many people's recovery from addiction is really more of a rude awakening. It's the truth that you, by your own might, by your own effort, by your own will, cannot overcome this thing called addiction. You, on your own, in your own self-sufficiency, are doomed. You need help from outside yourself, from something bigger, from something more powerful than you, and that is God. You wake up to the reality that you have a spiritual problem and you need a spiritual solution. Now, I understand if this language doesn't really sit right with Christians. I didn't know what to do with it early on either, until I realized the truth being described in what I just read. You see, the writers of the Big Book aren't trying to convince us to believe in God, specifically Jesus. Rather, their goal is to show us that you shouldn't believe in yourself as God. The truth is, you suck at being God of your life. You can't rely on yourself to get yourself out of your mess. It's a really important truth to accept and believe. This is the bad news before the good news, and most of us who find ourselves in recovery come face to face with the bad news, and it wakes us up to the reality that we need God. And I don't mean you need God in order to be saved or to be with Him eternally. That's all true, but that's not what I'm talking about. What I mean is what we discover in recovery, which is you need God so you don't wake up and implode your life today. Based on my experience, stories I've heard, and what's written about this, those who have addiction and are recovering have experienced the spiritual awakening, the rude awakening, the truth that self-sufficiency, it doesn't work, and on their own, they're doomed and they need God. And this truth is biblical, and it's captured by Paul in Romans 7, where he describes the reality that many of us find ourselves in. He says, "For I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. I want to stop and live a life I know I ought to live, but I can't. And it's so frustrating," if you've been there. He captures the frustration, but also the reality of hope when he writes, "Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord." Then he goes on in Romans 8 to paint a picture of what it looks like to rely on God and walk in the Spirit. This realization that you are hopeless on your own and need God is such an important moment. For most of us, until you get to this point where you wake up to reality, you will continue to trust in yourself. But those who are fortunate to experience this spiritual awakening, they have the option to live a different life, one not lived from self-sufficiency, but a life lived with reliance and dependence on God. For me, this reality was always there, nagging at me, but I didn't want to accept it because of my pride, my shame, and a desire to prove myself by my own will and efforts. As a Christian, I knew I needed Jesus for many things, but with my addiction, I was holding out. I kept trying to conquer it myself, and when inevitably everything just fell apart, I got my wake-up call. You cannot do this on your own. It's a similar theme with many people in recovery. You can't do this on your own. You need God's help. And once it's realized and accepted, recovery can start to really change someone's life. Steps, support, and spiritual awakening, this is really the core of recovery. And through this process of taking specific actions, depending on support and trusting and relying on God, healing comes to each area of life that addiction impacts. To put it all together and sum it up, in recovery, with the help of God and others, we take steps to get sober and clean so our bodies and our brains can heal. That's physical healing. With the help of God and others, we take steps to learn and practice coping with different emotions in new ways that don't involve numbing or avoiding them. For a lot of us, we feel for the first time and process old wounds. That's emotional healing. With the help of God and others, we take steps to discover and acknowledge all the craziness that is going on in our minds. We gain perspective, skills, and tools to help us navigate all the stuff that goes on in our minds and slowly find serenity, peace, and sanity. That's healing of the mind. With the help of God and others, we take steps to right our wrongs and make amends to those we have hurt. We stop hurting ourselves and we stop hurting others. We build intimate relationships with safe people. For most of us, this is the first time we're fully known by another human being. This is relational healing. And with the help of God and others, we take steps to grow closer to God, to trust His will over our own, to not just believe facts, but to believe His promises and act based on what we believe. The void that we once filled with our addiction begins to be filled by God. That's spiritual healing. Nothing is guaranteed, but recovery gives us hope. We like to say progress, not perfection, because this is a process of successes and failures. It's all new, but being in recovery greatly increases our chances of experiencing healing and a new way of living. That's it for this video on recovery. Thanks for watching. If you like this content, you can always subscribe and like the videos. But what I'd really appreciate is if you would share this with people you think would benefit. My mission is to create resources that help people live more faithfully, so sharing it would be a big help. Thanks.